From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, keeping your cool at the latest Sunday church visit when your denture adhesive is losing its grip. And now, the podcast host who has no worries for such things because his dentures are firmly in place and he is way too disruptive for church, Pete Dominic!
That is mostly right. Thank you very much, Pete Co., and happy Monday to you and everybody else. It's almost the final week of March, and more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, happy spring! That's right, if you are listening to this on March 20th at 5:24 Eastern Daylight Time, you have got the spring equinox in effect. It is the exact moment when the Earth's axis is tilted neither toward nor away from the sun, resulting in a nearly equal amount of daylight and darkness at all latitudes. Hashtag Spring Equinox 2023, and all of the daylight and warmth and rebirth and rejuvenation that it brings with it. I am very excited. I hope that you are as well. I have an excellent show. Joining me today, the legend Amy Westervelt, who might be one of the most respected climate journalists in the world. She is an award-winning investigative journalist and executive producer of the independent podcast production company Critical Frequency, and host of several podcasts, including Drilled, which has just launched its 8th season. I have an awesome conversation with Amy today. I've been missing my conversations with Mara Quint. I know many of you have as well. It's just been hard to get together the past few weeks, but don't worry, she will be back hopefully next week. And thank you, by the way, to Kayleen. She has been a longtime listener to this show. She emailed me and said, Friday's podcast was so good. Thank you. Your conversation with Christian Finnegan was especially good. I just love his take on things. He's always so thoughtful and makes you think. Please tell him how much I appreciate the thoughtfulness. Thank you, Kayleen. I thank you for your thoughtfulness, and I pass that along to Christian, and I really appreciate you. I appreciate all of you. Can't do the show without my subscribers, so thank you to everybody who is subscribing to the show. Of course, Sean Mills, Ronnie Gonzalez, Paul Sheard, Sharon Lamott, Steve Feldman, Steve Nygren, Stephen Chase, Tom Herman, Will Powers, so many more. Just reading off the list of subscribers for you real quick, and just can't do it without you, obviously. Thank you very much. I hope you are well. I hope that your weekend was great. There are a few things I want to mention here up top before I get to my conversation with Amy Westervelt, including you sending your questions. It is spring, and you have questions about gardening, don't you? About growing things? Well, the great Kevin Richburg, longtime listener, subscriber, and graduate of MIT, all-around brilliant guy. He's traveled the world. He's been to the ocean floor. He's been to almost every country on the planet, and he's got his own farm, his own orchard in upstate New York with his husband, and they are great guys who I know really well. And Kevin is going to join me. We're going to try to do a interview this week and include questions about growing things because he's so brilliant, and we'll do a little series on that for the spring before the ground thaws up there in New York, and then he's working outside probably 12 hours a day. So Kevin Richburg is going to be joining me, but send me your questions. Any questions you have about gardening, growing anything, climate, all of it, send it to standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, everybody is on indictment watch because former President Trump has been yelling and screaming and whining from the corner I imagine he sits in, and says that he's going to be indicted on Tuesday. We have this news from him, so hard to know exactly what's going on, but I decided there's just so much out there for everybody to take in and look at and read and pay attention to about this. If this is something that you're following, I can't do much better than all the mainstream media that's been covering it. And there's just so much speculation and analysis that I decided, you know what? I'm just going to leave that alone. Obviously, I'm paying close attention to it as you are, but we'll know soon enough what is exactly going to be the case. I think it'll be a matter of Tuesday. After it passes, we'll know a lot more. So I decided, you know what? I'm just not going to go crazy covering that, talking about that here on the show too much. I mean, I watched videos, I watched Kirshner and so many other analysts on it, but just the one idea of how people are going to react if he is indicted, he's demanding, obviously, that there be protests everywhere, and so there's much concern about violence. I don't think we're going to see that type of violence. He hasn't had time, frankly, to promote the violence the way he did for January 6th. But like people like Congressman Andy Biggs, who's a real creep, tweeted, if they can come for Trump, they'll come for you. This type of stuff only occurs in third world authoritarian nations. And just the idea that you're hearing a lot of people saying that this is not a crime, this thing that he could be indicted for on Tuesday with the Manhattan DA, that this is not worth pursuing the former president of the United States. But I mean, a lot of people are reacting with a similar kind of, listen, if you have sex with a porn star and then you pay the porn star to keep quiet about it. By the way, right after your son was born, to pay the porn star to keep quiet about it so you can win an election and then reimburse yourself for the payment and then lie about the whole thing while simultaneously throwing your attorney under the bus and letting him go to jail for it while you sit in the White House, then yeah, they'll probably come for you too. Who tweeted that? I forget, but I copied that down, and a lot of people with that same sentiment in response to those like Andy Biggs. So that's really all I've got to say about that at the moment. Of course, the other big story yesterday was the New York Times' Peter Baker had new reporting on the October surprise. Did you see about that? Did you hear about that? Thought that was a pretty big and interesting issue worth thinking about, talking about. I'll try to get Jonathan Alter on this, but the New York Times posted this blockbuster story yesterday, which Ben Barnes, a former Democratic lieutenant governor of Texas, described that he'd accompanied former Texas Governor John Connally, who got shot, by the way, in the same car as JFK, that he had accompanied him on a trip to the Mideast in the summer of 1980 on behalf of Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign. And according to Barnes, he and former Governor Connally urged Middle Eastern heads of state to tell the new revolutionary government in Iran to ignore President Carter and wait until Reagan was elected president before negotiating the release of the 52 American hostages held in Tehran. The Times story says it's not clear that this message was conveyed to the Iranians or that they acted on it, but journalist and biographer of Jimmy Carter, Jonathan Alter, friend of the show, yesterday in response to Peter Baker's story, he talked about it in his great book, The Biography of Jimmy Carter. He said the Iranians chose to negotiate with Carter, not Reagan, though there is strong circumstantial evidence that they received arms from the Reagan administration in exchange for delaying the release of hostages until after the 1980 election. Alter went on to say that he found the Times story a credible and important addition to what we already knew about the plot and the U.S. that came to be known as the October surprise, and he writes more about it, but it's a really important story, so I wanted to mention that. Just more horribleness from the Reagan administration that we learned. A lot of people think that Jimmy Carter would have won had he been able to get those hostages released. The only other thing I really wanted to mention here is that I feel like maybe it's been undercovered that it's been 20 years since the United States invaded Iraq. 2 decades ago, on March 19th, 2003, then President George W. Bush, who should have never been president, ordered the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And Peter Bergen writes at CNN and a piece about this. There's little question Saddam is one of the worst tyrants of the 20th century. He killed as many as 290,000 of his own people, according to Human Rights Watch. He also launched wars against 2 of his neighbors, Iran during the 80s and Kuwait in 1990. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 500,000 people were killed during these wars. So when Saddam was toppled by the Americans 2 decades ago, at least some Iraqis were happy. And Iraq today has made some strides to a more accountable political system compared to its neighbors in the Middle East. Iraq has had several elections since the U.S. invasion in 2003. They were followed by peaceful transfers of power. Yet Saddam was toppled by the U.S. The incompetent American occupation of Iraq contributed to a civil war that tore the country apart, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. More than 4,500 U.S. soldiers also died. And the war also gave al-Qaeda a new lease of life. The group known as al-Qaeda in Iraq later morphed into ISIS, which seized vast amounts of Iraqi territory in 2014 and instituted a reign of terror. And there's so much more to talk about this, including the cost, which is like $6 trillion, and 30,000 more veterans have taken their lives. Not all of them were veterans of Iraq. Some were, of course, in Afghanistan. But another really important point that a lot of people are making, including me, is the precedent that it sets. And Peter Bergen writes about this as well. How the Iraq War set a precedent for unprovoked wars that we see playing out in places like Ukraine today. Bergen goes on to write in this piece, and I thought it was really important, that the Russians are already using this to good effect. At a conference in India earlier this month, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called out what he termed as a U.S. double standard, saying, "You believe that the United States has the right to declare a threat to its national interest any place on the earth like they did in Iraq? This message may not resonate much in the West, but it does in the global South, Peter Bergen writes, where the U.S.-Iraq war and the Russian war in Ukraine are seen as, by many, as wars of choice rather than of necessity. There's a lot of more to say about this, but I thought that was really important. I'm going to be talking to Alison Jaslow, who's the new president of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, on Thursday, probably post it for Friday, and probably talk to some other people about it as well. 20 years, and I covered this for years on SiriusXM. I talked to veterans and officers and Iraqis and journalists, analysts, national security experts, dozens and dozens who wrote books about it, who served, and it forever changed my life. So it's something I'm certainly thinking about 20 years later and wondering where rest of media is on it. And maybe we'll hear more this week. But 20 years, 2 decades ago, the U.S. invaded Iraq. And I thought that was definitely worth mentioning here. All right, let me just play a couple of clips from the Sunday shows. For some reason on ABC's This Week, they had Mike Pence on, which was really, I don't know why we're still talking to Mike Pence. I guess to me, every time that Mike Pence goes out and in any way kind of looks the other way or somehow defends even slightly Donald Trump, and instead of just going crazy on him for basically throwing him under the bus and putting his entire family at risk, it seems worth playing for me. But here he is on ABC yesterday.
I'm sure you've seen Donald Trump is saying that he's going to be indicted on Tuesday. He's calling for people to protest. Now, we don't know if that's true. The Manhattan DA has not said anything about it. But he's calling for people to protest. Is that irresponsible?
Well, first, let me say I'm taken aback at the idea of indicting a former president of the United States at a time when there's a crime wave in New York City. The fact that the Manhattan DA thinks that indicting President Trump is his top priority, I think, just tells you everything you need to know about the radical left in this country. It just feels like a politically charged prosecution here. And I, for my part, I just feel like it's just not what the American people want to see.
First of all, whenever a politician like Mike Pence, of course, says is not what the American people want to see, as if he somehow holds the American public opinion of anybody other than a few people like him, just like nobody like him. But second of all, a crime wave in New York City, that is what everybody was reacting to yesterday, including Kurt Bardella, who said, white-collar crime really isn't crime, apparently. Kevin Cruz tweeted, New York City murders, shootings, subway crime dropped in February, continuing downward trend, according to the NYPD. David Roberts wrote, New York City is one of the safest, lowest crime cities in a country, a lot safer than small towns and rural areas, and linked to stats. And Scott Heckinger tweeted, many of the loudest voices blame progressive criminal justice reforms for crime, but 8 of the 10 states with the highest murder rates are red states. So I just thought I would include the reactions to stupid Mike Pence there. And then, speaking of Republicans who really don't have an answer for questions, here is Patrick McHenry. He is on CBS Face the Nation yesterday with Margaret Brennan. I tweeted this out because I thought Margaret Brennan always does a pretty good job in terms of all the corporate mainstream media Sunday shows. At least she is always prepared and has a delicate dance with tough questions, good questions for her guests. This is Republican Patrick McHenry. He is the chairman of the very powerful Financial Services Committee, and she asked him to answer for all these ridiculous criticisms that many on the right are making, that banks are collapsing because of woke culture. And I thought this was a really good 2 minutes here.
I want to ask you about some of the things being said. Populist politics around banking, everyone engages in.
It never ends.
It never ends. But the 2 banks that did fail, they were in New York and they were in California. Conservatives like Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, your colleague James Comer, they're throwing around terms like woke banks advancing the liberal agenda. They're blaming diversity and environmental initiatives. Isn't there a danger in casting a very substantive, active crisis in terms of a culture war?
I think everyone's preaching their book. And that's what we heard in your first segment.
Right. But you agree that's not helpful.
Their book. And their book is, well, if they thought it was a problem a month ago, they apply it to this circumstance. That's happening on both sides of the aisle. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the question of ESG and these initiatives,
environmental
social and governance.
Right. And the encouragement of companies to take that into consideration with their investment.
Yes. So there has been a lot of political debate about that. There is substance here. And if the management of these institutions was much more concerned about politics or the environmental or social goods rather than the governance regulations, ensuring you had a capable board, you had proper oversight of people's deposits, then this shows they had mismanagement. So I think there are
Do you have evidence of that? There wasn't a risk officer fully at Silicon Valley Bank for an extended period of time.
Yes, and you had very few people that had banking expertise on the board of the bank. So there are some questions, natural questions we should raise.
But that's bad management. That's not woke banking, whatever that means.
But as I said, whatever your book of business was as a politician a month ago, a year ago, is applied to this general circumstance. What I'm trying to do is get to the details of what happened and have and then determine whether or not there's a proper legislative response.
Yes.
But when you have a hammer, you look at the world as a nail. Right. And that's what we see out of politicians.
All right. You hear that? He said nothing. Absolutely nothing. There is no answer. He stinks. And I thought that was a pretty good job by Margaret Brannon over at CBS. I shared that clip yesterday on Twitter, if anybody cares. Okay, well, that's it. I guess that's it. Let's get to my interview with the great Amy Westervelt, shall we? More news and stuff tomorrow, but right now I'm very excited to bring on my guest. She's an award-winning investigative journalist, executive producer of the independent podcast production company Critical Frequency, as I mentioned earlier. The podcast is named one of the best podcasts of the year by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, recently by The New York Times. It's received awards for its excellence. She's been nominated for the Peabody Award last year. Her investigative climate podcast, which we talked about today, is called Drilled. In 2015, Amy received a Rachel Carson Award for greening journalism for her role in creating a women-only climate journalism group, syndicating long-form climate reporting to The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Economist, and many more outlets. She's a 20-year veteran investigative journalist. Her earlier work was for NPR, The Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, Inside Climate News, and various other outlets. She earned a Edward R. Murrow, an ONA, and Folio awards as well, and she is often cited as amongst the earliest examples of accountability reporting on climate. I'm so happy to have her back on the show to talk about Season 8 of Drilled. Ladies and gentlemen, Amy Westervelt is back. Let's do it. All right. I've got her back now. I'm really, really excited to have such a respected, credible, awesome journalist joining us, doing great work. Congratulations on Season 8, just launched Episode 1. Amy Westervelt, welcome back to Stand Up. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk to you about your very important work. Season 8 has launched. It's another fascinating deep dive into a very, very important issue in development. But I got to tell you, I was just on the newsletter, drilledpodcast.com, and I got to say, I can't believe I haven't been reading this because I always listen to the pod, but I wasn't reading it. Tell people about the work that you do with your newsletter. Everybody should subscribe right now.
Yes, thank you. Well, I usually will have one kind of longer piece in the newsletter talking about whatever the climate news is that week. And then I give people, my top 5 or 6 links to either stories or studies that came out that week. So it's like a 10-minute read that kind of keeps you in the know on climate every week. And
I would even say, if you don't have 10 minutes to read or even 5 minutes to read, if you scroll to the bottom, because you want to keep up with climate news. I love those links. This week's climate must reads are really, because I know that you selected them, so I give them that much more. I'm like, yes, this is good. But let me ask you, I think this is your most recent post. And if you'll indulge me in just reading the first paragraph and then asking you this question.
Yeah.
You write, this is titled The Trouble with Market-Based Climate Solutions. And you write, over the past several months, I've been working on 3 stories that on the surface don't have much to do with each other. They were focused on fossil fuel funding of university research, Exxon pulling funding from algae biofuels research, and the country of Guyana emerging as a new oil state, which of course is what this season's pod is based on. But you write, the line that keeps popping in mind when I think about each of them, though, is this is what happens when you leave a problem like climate change to the, quote, market to solve. What did you find?
Oh, my God. Yeah. I mean, in all three of those cases, we're relying on oil companies to solve climate change. And that's never going to work, guys. It's never going to work. That's what I found. It's like, look, if you're going to let oil companies be the major funder of research, not just into climate science and, possible technical solutions, but also in a lot of cases, public policy schools, sociology research, economics research, law research, then you're going to end up with all of these suggestions that are like, don't do anything that will make oil companies, less profitable. Same on the technical side. Exxon and every other oil major invested in algae biofuels forever. And I don't know, in a lot of ways, I'm like, I wonder either if they had actually invested in the way that they all claimed they were going to, like, would we have had algae biofuels 10 years ago? Who knows? Did their investments in biofuels in general, including algae, actually delay electrification? Because that was kind of the purpose, right? Like the reason that oil companies are interested in biofuels is that biofuels don't require getting rid of the combustion engine. So it doesn't require a massive infrastructure change that would make fossil fuels not work anymore the way that electrification does. So that's like a big reason that they all invested in biofuels research. So I understand why they do it. What I don't understand is why we consistently are letting the industry that created the problem be in charge of how we solve it.
I think you do understand that. And I think
I do, yeah. Yeah, it makes me crazy, but yes.
Well, there's a multitude of reasons, and it can have to do with Congress and the way we elect people and how legislation is written. And it can have to do with business and lobbying and just regular old capitalism and markets, and the fact that ordinary people, or even, let's say more specifically, people that might be really living in poverty, could stand to come out of poverty overnight. And that's going to make their lives better, whether it be fracking in Pennsylvania or in Guyana, I think to a certain extent. So maybe just pick one of those multitude of reasons as to why it continues to be problematic, the way that we are heading and the way that we make decisions on our energy supplies that obviously are affecting our future and our present.
Yeah. I mean, the news this week of the U.S. government approving the Willow project is another really good example. Like, you had Kamala Harris and President Biden both kind of being like, yes, we're very concerned about climate change. And like, that's why we're, on this path to, making all of these big investments in renewable energy. And even that, it's like, investments in renewable energy, if they are made right alongside expanding fossil fuel production, will not do anything to curb climate change.
There's a metaphor. There's a billion metaphors of buckets of water.
Exactly. It's like you cannot continue to expand fossil fuel production if your goal is to act on climate. The end. That's it. It's very, like, all of the science says that. It's very straightforward. And there are all of these convoluted, mental gymnastics that these folks go through to try to suggest that somehow fossil fuels are a key part of the climate solution. And, that's because the industry has had so much money and so much power for so long. They are an enormous driver of the economy, and they're one of the top lobbying groups in the world, period. And I think that's another thing that's important for people to understand. Like, these aren't U.S. companies. These are global companies that in a lot of ways have more power than any one government.
You mentioned, and you actually talked to Steve Cole in episode 1. And he wrote,
Private Empire. So good.
I interviewed him several times over the years for all of his books, I think. And he's one of the most respected journalists in the world, I think. And you can talk a little bit about Private Empire, but I mean, I just believe that, like, in the first section of that book, he talks about the history of Exxon, and it's got its own, like, State Department. And
yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And like, he has this amazing quote from Lee Raymond in that book, who was the guy that ran Exxon during, like, their key kind of climate denial years. Yeah. He has this amazing quote from him being like, I don't like, they were getting a lot of heat at one time for propping up dictatorial governments, right? Like they were investing big in Equatorial Guinea and Chad and all of these areas where the government was very clearly oppressing people, and the few leaders were just taking all of the money for themselves and all these things. So they were getting a lot of bad press about it. And Lee Raymond was kind of like, we're not an American oil company. Like we're a global oil company, and we don't really like, we're not here to bring American democracy around the world. We're here to make fucking money off of oil.
Right. And way well said. And then, by the way, in reading that book, I'll never forget, because there's a whole deep dive into Rex Tillerson. And so having that book, a lot of people knew, if you're paying attention even a little, that the CEO of Exxon was Rex Tillerson. But if you read that book and you saw that Donald Trump appointed Rex Tillerson to be his Secretary of State, you would have, as I did, when I saw Rex Tillerson's name, Secretary of State, I stopped in my tracks knowing what I learned from reading Steve's book. It's crazy. No,
it's crazy. And at the time, it was just so like bold and transparent, because at the time, Exxon's biggest issue was getting U.S. policy changed in a way that would let their Russian investments really pay off. And like, it's like, oh, now we run the State Department. So
yeah, no, the line that I think he writes, Exxon operates as if it has its own State Department. Its budget is bigger than many countries, whatever. And then the next line is, the new Secretary of State, the new guy running the State Department, is like, there's no conspiracies here. It's on the front page.
Out in the open.
Exactly. But to be fair, there is a lot of shadowy shit. And you talk about this at the beginning, and you've obviously, unfortunately, experienced this. Talk to me about what it's like to report on Exxon, because Steve Cole says on your episode, he's like, I've reported on the CIA, I've reported on Al Qaeda, but I told my friends, if I ever get disappeared, don't look at either of them. Look at Exxon. He basically says that, I'm paraphrasing, on the first episode of this season. Tell me what your experiences have been on reporting on Exxon. You are a very courageous person.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're, like Steve says, they have a lot of money and power, and they have a real strategy around trying to intimidate people. So I've had the experience of, at any time and I have to say, like, Exxon is fairly unique in this, because I've reported on Chevron pretty extensively too. I've reported on BP and Shell, and I have not had the same level of like creepy, shadowy shit happen when I report on those companies. So
what have you had happen?
Every time I'm doing an Exxon story and I have to travel for it, all my travel arrangements get messed up. So like when I was interviewing all of the former Exxon scientists, I would show up to the airport and my flight had been canceled, or I would get a call from the hotel saying that, my reservation was canceled. That happened when I was going to Guyana, like the morning I was leaving for Georgetown, which is not like a super easy place to navigate, by the way. Like, it's not like you can show up in Georgetown and go just get a room.
Guyana in South America.
Guyana. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, like I was at the airport waiting for my flight, and I got this message on my phone that my reservation had been canceled. And I called the hotel, and they were like, yes, you canceled this reservation this morning, ma'am. And I'm like, no, I didn't,
Do you have any way of ever attributing it to them?
No, it's impossible to like track it to them. I actually cut stuff out of this episode because our lawyer was kind of like, I don't know. But like, I mean, this time actually Guyana's interesting, because you have a situation where the government is very much in bed with the oil company too. So it's not like if something happens, you can go to the police there and they're going to be like on your side against the oil company. So yeah, like I had my hotel room broken into, and some files were taken off my computer.
Oh.
I've been followed before. There's like a lot of stuff that happens.
Well, it's all that more important to subscribe and support your work. And let's get into it, because we touched it around season 8. Light, sweet, crude.
Sweet, crude, baby. Yeah.
Just drop. It's fascinating how you always do your work. Let me just say, this actually, you created this podcast a couple years ago, and you basically built it like a true crime podcast. And and it's hard. It's also listed in true crime on different podcasts.
Yeah.
So, it's a really smart thing to do a podcast. I mean, to me, the whole goal has always been to fight apathy, make people care about things they normally wouldn't. So I've tried that my whole career. In this case, you drop your podcast. It's done in that true crime fashion, but you drop it in that section. My question is, have you found like people that don't care about these issues, climate or anything else, that found your podcast and really loved it because of the way that you do it in that format?
Yeah. And that was kind of the idea too. Like, I don't really feel like anyone who's already kind of a climate person necessarily like needs that much more information, Right. But I wanted to, there's two things. One, I think if you're telling a good story, it's a good story. And, it shouldn't matter whether people know that much about climate science or policy or whatever or not. And then two, the fossil fuel industry has spent like 100 years and, billions of dollars on shaping a narrative around, what they do and how much benefit they bring and all of that stuff. And I felt like people need a different narrative structure, and this is a familiar one because it's a really complicated topic, right? Like,
yes,
for a long time, the media has covered climate in pretty dry, scientific or policy articles, right? And like, I don't even like to read that stuff, like climate podcasts forever were just like a host talking to a policy wonk. I don't like to listen to that. It's boring to me,
Yeah.
So I'm like, people need stories. People need like a way through to understand what's happening here. And also I had the experience reporting one season where I followed around a bunch of crab fishermen on the West Coast, and they were actually suing the oil companies. And they were all like, a lot of them were total climate deniers. Like they were like, we don't think that it's even, like it's a natural thing, ice ages, blah, blah, blah. And yet they were suing the oil companies, and they explained that the reason why was that they had seen documents showing that the oil companies had taken out patents to like prepare their business for climate in the 80s and had told them kind of not to worry about it. So they're like, oh, that's just not fair. Like, if you have information that will help everyone, you should share that information and not like hide it or spin it or whatever. So for them, it was like, it doesn't matter, like they didn't need to understand climate science. They didn't even need to make the ideological, like political affiliation leap of saying that they believe that climate change is happening. All they needed to know was that this company hid information that would have helped them prepare for a problem.
Right. Exactly the point, why it matters to them and why it should matter to everybody. You talked about how complicated this reporting and these issues are. And I think that even in our world of everything is a binary. And when it comes to these issues, it's kind of environmentalists and scientists versus capitalists and oil and gas executives. And that's it. And it's sad because that's ridiculous. And it's not anywhere near realistic. We're humans. We consume. Let's talk about how complicated it is. So it's whether it's the Willow oil drilling project in Alaska that's just been greenlit. I just talked to Emily Atkin about that. Her
awesome.
Great reporting on the media's reporting of it. Or Guyana. One thing that's complicated is you find people who live in these areas, even those that might be indigenous, are often divided themselves because of some really important fair things to talk about. Talk to me about, as we get into season 8 here, what you learned about people in Guyana, the government. Basically, they found a whole bunch of oil off the coast of these countries. And that means everybody or a few people could get really rich.
Right.
The companies. But when you look at a country, and this is important for every country and every oil company, they have a deal to make. It's their property.
Right.
Exxon has all the infrastructure. Oil companies, big ones with billions of dollars, have the infrastructure to get that oil. Guyana doesn't. Take us inside kind of some of the conflict and what you learned as they learned about this money that they could dig up under the ocean floor.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because, I mean, honestly, like if you zoom way out, it's just the story of colonialism, like these countries are in the position of being in poverty in the first place because of colonialism. The global north has done nothing to repair that harm. And so now they're in the position of, kind of, again, like going to oil companies to help them pay to adapt to climate change. So in the case of Guyana, Exxon went there in 1999 initially and got a contract in place. It was actually Exxon and Shell initially as a joint partnership. And that's because they were drilling in Venezuela and Venezuela was getting a little uppity and they were worried about it, right? So they're like, okay, well, these basins are all kind of intersecting. Let's look at Guyana. Let's look at Suriname, which is right next door, just in case things pop off in Venezuela. Then Venezuela ends up kicking out most of the foreign oil majors. And, right around that time is when Exxon starts to explore in Guyana in earnest. So they did their first deep water exploration in 2008. They found oil in 2015, announced to everyone, significant amounts of oil found off the coast of Guyana. And then in 2016, they do a new contract with Guyana. But at that point, they know exactly, that there is oil and that there's a lot of oil. So they do this contract and now they're kind of saying like, well, Guyana is a frontier country and, it was high risk, so we couldn't give them too much, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of runs counter to what they announced. So they have this contract with Guyana now, right? They're allowed to take 75% of every barrel of oil to pay off their expenses. There is no transparent accounting of those expenses. So they can claim like that the bill isn't paid for, forever. 75% off the top, straight to the oil companies. Then the rest, the 25% remaining, gets supposed to get split between Guyana and the oil companies. But Exxon's getting a bunch of other stuff too. They don't have to pay tax in Guyana. In fact, the government of Guyana pays Exxon's Guyanese income tax for them. And gives them a receipt, which they can then use on their U.S. taxes to write off
double
taxes that they're not paying in Guyana.
Wow. And this because of the report, so much reporting that has been done on this. You introduced us to this maybe you weren't done. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. There's I'll just say like the other stuff on there's a lot of stuff on the contract that's very complicated and like ends up making it not so great for Guyana. One of which is that this running tab that they have of expenses, they are putting development for all of the future wells onto that too. So Exxon's paying itself back up front. And they're doing that, I think, I can't, they won't admit this publicly, but I think they're doing that because they know that in 10 years' time, the financial situation is probably going to look really different. If there's carbon taxes, if the world is shifting off of fossil fuels, all of a sudden demand is going down. They're all predicting that demand will be going down in the next 10 to 20 years. So they want to get the most money up front so that when, the price of oil falls or those, reserves just aren't worth as much anymore, it's Guyana that has that loss and not them.
So we are only one episode in here, but we learn a lot in this first episode, and we don't want to give any too much away. But let me just ask you a little bit more about Guyana. You went down there yourself. Yeah. You met an enterprising young reporter who has a pretty robust, it would seem, outfit. They got a whole oil and gas desk, several reporters assigned to those industries. Yeah. Tell us about what you learned going there. Is it a nice? I was about to say, is it a nice country? What is shitty?
Is it nice there? Yeah.
Is it a nice country?
It's beautiful. It's very beautiful. It's very lush. Like, 90% of the country's population is located in this tiny strip on the coast, and the rest is like totally wild. It is one of the world's largest carbon sinks right now. That's what makes this project, kind of concerning from a climate perspective. It is a huge, protector of biodiversity in the world. It is very, very beautiful. They have amazing food. It's a very interesting mix of cultures. It's the only South American country where English is the primary language because they were a British colony for a long time. So they have this super colonial past, right? It's like you've got all these canals built in Georgetown, Guyana because of Dutch colonialism. You've got a mix of different types of people living there. So you have like Afro-Caribbean people there. You have West Indian people there. You have a fairly large Chinese population there. It's a big kind of mix. And a lot of times the politics break down over racial lines. So different political parties like represent different racial groups, which was really interesting for us. And it's very fraught too. So like right now you have the more Indian party in power. And so if you say anything critical of the oil project, then they're like, oh, that's just because you support the other political party. So it makes it hard for the reporters there to kind of cover the story because everyone just sort of assumes a political or racial bias. And we haven't covered this in the podcast yet, but it's coming. That robust desk of journalists is now down to the one that we are working with.
Oh, why?
Because Exxon and the government have hired them all into their comms departments. Yeah, it's a really good example of like trying to buy social license and trying to, kind of quickly get rid of any, internal criticism in the country. Yeah.
Wow.
I know.
I mean, it's just, it's really obviously depressing because journalism and money and making, it's such a noble profession, but you're almost never going to make, it's increasingly, obviously, day after day, month after month, much money, much less a lot of money. And then this guy comes over here and says, you can make a ton of money. Come work for me.
Come work for us. And they're offering them new cars too, which I think is a fun little bonus.
Well, Amy, that's why we brought you here today, actually. Bring it in, guys. Amy, what did you like? Has anybody ever tried to buy you off?
No, I don't think so.
Damn it.
No.
Well, we're going to change that.
Yeah. Offer is accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're doing, I mean, your product, it is so good and you're doing such great work that I think, you've been able to hopefully do well because it's such important reporting. And there's, not the kind of reporting out there that you're doing. I've learned so much in this first episode and so much more to learn. What else do we have to learn in this season or anything else that you want to here at the end that you're paying attention to or covering? Because you're doing so much.
Yeah. So like one of the kind of big things that we're tackling this season is this, again, really entrenched narrative of fossil fuels lift people out of poverty.
Yes.
Fossil fuels will solve all of the development problems of the global South. When in reality, what's happening is something that's happened many times before. We saw it with cigarettes. We're starting to see it with cars now. Like as the global North shifts to electric vehicles, they're dumping combustion engine cars on global South countries. There was like a saying with the tobacco industry that the Marlboro man didn't die. He just moved to Africa. That's a thing. The plastic stuff, as global North countries start to crack down on plastic, they're dumping it in global South countries. The same exact thing is happening with fossil fuels, and it's being painted as like a huge gift, but it's like the pox infested blankets of today,
Wow, that's a really interesting way of putting it. But I'm not even, do we even need some of those parallels when you can look? I feel like there are certain countries, and I can't remember. I feel like Nigeria and some.
Yes, Nigeria is a really great example because the thing that like all of these people talk about is energy poverty. It's more important to solve energy poverty than to get on top of the climate crisis. Now you've got folks like Jordan Peterson on this bandwagon as well,
really?
Right? It's not, he's into it. It's not just the oil companies and
he just can't stay like on just bashing trans people or gay, like he has and women. He's
on this train now too. Yeah. And I think Nigeria is the best example of why that argument is flawed because they have been an oil producing country for longer than almost any other global South country. And they are last place on access to energy in the world still today. So the idea that more fossil fuel development or that developing fossil fuels in these countries will solve energy poverty in these countries is disproved by data over and over and over again. And that's something that like we're showing in this season.
But that's in the aggregate. But the point is, some people do get rich. I mean, if you want to step out of Africa, because we can talk about conflict and all kinds of other and pollution and the oil spills from those pipelines in a place like Nigeria. But if you look at Pennsylvania, or if you look at Alaska, where you have tribal people at odds with each other, it is no doubt that many of those people will make a lot of money.
They do, but what the economic data shows is that since 1980. Any country or even region that has had an oil boom, it's the same process over and over again. They get wealthy, they hang on to that wealth for a little while, and then they like lose it all. And in a lot of cases end up worse off 20, 30 years down the road than they were before.
Probably true almost always that they end up worse off. I'm not sure which examples. I mean, it depends on how you measure it. But Colin Gerald-Mack, who's an NYU environmental professor, wrote this great book. Do you know him?
I love that book too. Up to Heaven,
Down to Hell.
So yeah.
And it documents a guy who sold his family property, made a bunch of money, but all of a sudden, like, had lost rights to his own property. Like, drive in and they're like, sir, you can't come back here. He's like, it's my backyard. Like, sorry, sir, we're drilling. We got trucks moving. And it's one example, but there's so many other like that. Even those who sell their rights end up losing in so many other ways.
Yeah. It's like, it ends up, it's short-term gain, but a long-term loss every single time. Right. And now, actually, the other thing I think that's worth noting is in April, Guyana is having a big oil auction. So they've had enough of taking all this criticism for signing this terrible contract with Exxon. And their solution is to open up a bunch more oil blocks to other oil companies. And they're drafting a new contract to govern those projects. So I it seems to me like the government is like, okay, if we can fast track these other people producing and get that money in more quickly, then, we'll be able to show people like, look, this has actually been good for the economy. They'll be able to do more of the sorts of things that they've kind of promised oil wealth will bring, but it hasn't yet. So that's happening April, like mid-April.
Where is that criticism been coming from? Is it internal? Is it domestic?
Both. Yeah. Domestic and internationally. So, I mean, even like you've got the IMF and the World Bank and S&P Global all saying this is not a fair deal to Guyana. And I asked Exxon about this. Like, we fact check with Exxon too, and they said, well, Guyana is considered a frontier country. And so the royalty that they have, which is they get 2% on top of sort of their profit share. They get a 2% royalty as well on barrels of oil. Well, I mean, if you can look at a list of royalty rates for oil producing countries, and like the most frontier country get 5%. So if Guyana is getting less than half of what sort of the next, smallest country is getting, and we know that Exxon knew at the time of signing that contract that there was a significant amount of oil there. So it's hard to believe that, they actually think that this contract is fair, but they're not going to renegotiate it. It's great for them, right? So the government's only real path to solving this problem is to get more oil contracts in place so there's less focus on Exxon and so that there's more money coming in more quickly.
Great reporting, great work. So psyched to talk to you again. And everybody should go to drilledpodcast.com. And not only, if you haven't listened to seasons 1 through 7, there's so much to learn. And you've done such great work, award-winning work. It always gets named as top podcasts. Keep it up. It's so important. And you really are the best at it. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
There you go, Amy Westervelt, everybody. Go subscribe to Drilled. Go subscribe to a newsletter. All of the information is in the show links in today's episode. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. If you haven't signed up for a subscription, I could use it. Go to standupwithpete.com or patreon.com/Pete Dominick right now. Give a review on Apple, Spotify podcasts. If you've never done that, maybe today is the day you could. And thanks again. You guys are the best. The show is free, but it costs a lot. A lot of time, a lot of resources. So could use the help. Subscribe now. All right, that's it. John Carroll, take us out. Thank you, Odessa. Thank you, Pete Coe. And I will talk to you tomorrow.
Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. We got to open up the window to let in some light. You gotta stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.